Hey there, this is your pal Pally, and welcome back to Git Er Raid. This is Tier 15 Heroic Throne of Thunder, and next up is Council of Elders. This encounter is one of the tougher heroic bosses in the tier that requires pretty solid execution from your raid team. It does require 2 tanks, any mix of DPS, and 2 to 3 healers on 10 man. Your choice to 2 or 3 heal it will probably dictate the strategies you employ, and of course will be dependent on your gear level. The fight's basic premise is that you have to deal with the normal mechanics of the bosses, but each have a little twist. So let's go through each of those twists, and then talk about how to deal with them. The biggest twist that will give your raid group fits is the first one, the Frost King. He still sends out Frostbite, and you still can group up to spread the damage around, except as soon as you start soaking the damage for your fellow raider, you get a debuff called Body Heat. After 8 seconds, that debuff turns into Chilled to the Bone, and you are unable to soak any more damage from Frostbite for 8 seconds. So why is that so bad? Well, Frostbite hits a lot harder on Heroic as it ticks for 300k plus per second. Raids have dealt with this in a few ways. The strategy in this video revolves around creating groups of stackers for the Frostbite victim to rotate around in. Other groups simply out-heal the damage of it by spamming heals on that person and rotating external CDs. This is why I mentioned that your choice of 2 heals versus 3 would probably dictate your strategy. It's likely that 3 healing it would allow you to ignore stacking and just have the huge focus of the healers be on that one person. With 2 healing, it's probably best to try some sort of stacked group approach. One side note is that some classes can completely bypass this mechanic if they are quick enough. Paladins with Divine Shield, Mages with Ice Block, and Druids with Symbiosis of Ice Block can watch for the Frostbite arrow to come over their head, and if they are quick to hit their immunity, they will prevent it from being applied. Sadly, in the 80+ pulls on this encounter, I'm pretty sure that Hunter's Deterrence does not prevent Frostbite from being applied. It certainly cuts down on the damage to the Hunter, but it doesn't give them an immunity from the effect. So figure out what strategy works best for you getting through this phase. In the footage here, we have 2 ranged groups, one group consisting of the tanks, and finally another group with the 2 melee. Since Frostbite only targets ranged and heals, we could be pre-stacked in our ranged group, and then once there was 2 seconds left before the stack group was chilled to the bone, we would move to the tank group, and then the melee group, and so on until Frostbite was done. Personal CDs are obviously popped as much as possible for the Frostbite victim, and they really just need to focus on surviving most of all. Moving on to the Priestess, her twist is, well, twisted, namely Twisted Fate. She will pick 1 melee and 1 person who is furthest from her and will spawn an ad from them. Those ads will walk together, causing pulsing raid damage. The closer together those ads are, the more raid damage they do, and if one dies before the other, it will pulse out even bigger raid damage. These ads can be stunned, rooted, and snared, and you'll want to do all of the above if you have it available. The goal for the Twisted Fate ads is to split your DPS and make sure they stay as far away as possible while being DPS down evenly. Make liberal use of those roots, stuns, pushbacks, and snares to keep them apart, and the raid damage is pretty minimal. But of course, make sure you have someone as far away from her as possible, or else she will spawn the ads pretty close together. This mechanic isn't too bad to deal with as long as the ads don't move very much and die pretty close to the same time. Next up, Kazrajin's Empowerment. He goes from reflecting 25% of your individual damage back at you to reflecting 10% of all of his damage taken back to the whole raid. This can get tricky, of course, if you have high DPS. If I shoot a 100k arcane shot to his dome, I have to realize that I just hit my entire raid for 10k. Multiply that out by 5 to 6 DPSers, and you can see how quickly this can turn ugly. The lesson here is to rotate raid CDs and to do steady DPS. If you are a DPS class, try to save your big hitting abilities for when he's actually rolling and not when he is doing overcharged. Obviously though, you have to break his empowerment, so you can't slack at DPS either. Find a balance. If Sol is dead at this point, you can also have the raid stack on Kazrajin in order to do some effective raid healing. Lastly, I'll only briefly mention Sol's empowerment. It was more of an issue when people weren't as geared, but nowadays most strategies involve killing Sol off before he gets empowered, so you may never see it. The theory is that if he gets empowered and there is a sand trap touching or overlapping another sand trap, he'll spawn a super ad that will destroy your raid in quick fashion. So the way to deal with this was to make sure that no sand traps ever overlapped during the whole fight. This made your positioning during the entire fight supremely important. But like I said, very few raids will ever see this empowerment, as the strategies don't ever call for taking it. So with that, let's move into some overall strategy tips and tricks. As I just mentioned, you want to burn and kill Sol as fast as possible. You don't want to deal with his empowerment, plus the sand bolts he casts hurt a ton. Lusting on the pull and going all out on him is the recommended strategy. After the first Blessed Loa Spirit ad spawns, you need to figure out a decent split of your DPS in order to keep killing Sol, but also breaking subsequent empowerments. We left our melee on Sol pretty much until he died. This also helped with interrupts. The only exception was that we had our warrior switch off during the Priestess's empowerment to stun and kill the melee Twisted Fate ad before returning to Sol. That left our 4 range to break empowerments. One note is that it isn't too terrible to take some dark power ticks from these bosses. The damage ramps up slowly, so even being in dark power for 5 to 7 seconds isn't bad if you are accomplishing other goals like killing off Sol. Just figure out what the DPS split is, and then make sure people are switching targets appropriately. We also preferred to get the Priestess as the second empowerment. Remember too that she needs to be away from the other bosses when she is unempowered due to her healing spirit, but when she is empowered, you can interrupt her casts and stack her up with the others to get some cleave going. Once she is positioned, you just have to ensure that someone is out at max range to get the Twisted Fate ads. Kill them off evenly and you win. For us, Sol died during the second empowerment, which then allowed melee to help finish off breaking the Priestess's empowerment. Remember to interrupt the Priestess and get her away from the other bosses once she is done being empowered. With Sol dead, the only possible choice for empowerment will be Kazrajin. As mentioned, try to stack up and do steady EPS. One note here is that the Frost King will still throw out Biting Cold, so unstack before it comes out, and then let the person who has it stand out there while everyone else stacks back up. You don't want any more unnecessary raid damage at this point. This is definitely the time for raid CDs, so rotate through them. After this point, you'll be rotating through the bosses. Whichever one has the highest health will get empowered. It's likely you'll get one more Frost King empowerment before he's dead, but you'll also only likely get one Frostbite going out. If you have the luxury of still having your B-Res and Frostbite goes out on someone who can't immune it, just let them die and burn your battle res. Our poor Warlock was that sacrificial lamb here, but it really does help out having not to worry about stack groups or straining your healers to keep that person alive. You will likely kill off Frost King second and have Kazrajin at 50% health and the Priest at 30% or so. Be very careful during Kazrajin's final empowerments. I know we wiped at least a few times at this point because we all got excited that we were close to downing it, so we slammed our DPS buttons hard. Don't do it. Just go through it nice and steady and keep it under control. Lastly, there is one more twist to the entire fight that I haven't mentioned yet. It is called Soul Fragment. Every other time that you break an empowerment, a debuff goes out to a random player. It inflicts 55k shadow damage every 5 seconds. It's not so bad, you say. Well, every time it ticks, it gives you another stacking debuff called Shadowed Soul that increases your damage taken by 3% throughout the whole rest of the fight. Once you get Soul Fragment, you'll notice you get an extra action button. You are able to pass Soul Fragment by targeting one of your fellow raid members and then clicking on this button. Your stacks of Shattered Soul will always remain, but you'll no longer be taking damage from Soul Fragment, of course. In general, the strategy for dealing with this mechanic is to stack it on your melee most of all, but share it around to everyone as you can. Having 5 stacks of it on all of your ranged and heals is nothing big. Your melee take very little other damage in the fight, so they can go up to 10 before passing it along. Early on in the fight, avoid giving it to tanks. But once Sol and the Frost King are dead, there's no reason that a tank can't take 20 to 30 stacks. You'll have 3 soul fragments to pass around by the end, so make sure 2 of them are on the tanks at that point and go from there. Try also to avoid putting soul fragment on someone who is taking frostbite or biting cold. It hurts enough already. Just try to communicate and ask who can take stacks or work out a rotation ahead of time. And that's pretty much all there is to this fight. So work out how you're going to handle frostbite, remember all the twists in this encounter, and you'll have yourself a kill soon enough. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe, comment, and/or like this video if you found it helpful. Have a good one.